Okay, so welcome to the last part of the tissues lecture. So today I'm going to talk about muscle tissue, nervous tissue, and then a little bit about tissue repair. Of course, we will talk more about these specific tissue types when we get to their appropriate body system. So we'll talk about muscle tissue when we talk about muscles, and so on. So for muscle tissue, the function is movement. Okay, and in order to move, muscles have to contract. So they get shorter. And as that muscle tissue gets shorter, it causes a movement. So, in order for that contraction and movement to happen, um, there needs to be a lot of um, ions present, calcium, sodium, potassium. So the cells are well vascularized, so those ions can get there. Muscle tissue also needs a lot of energy in order to do that work, and so all of that blood flow brings sugars and things as well. Muscle, when you look at the tissue, you're going to see that there are elongated cells, so they're long and thin. And then there are cytoskeletal proteins within them that allow there to be that contraction to happen, that shortening. And again, we'll talk much more about this when we talk about muscles themselves. There are three main types of muscle tissue. Um, the only one that you need to identify visually, like on a slide, is going to be this first one, skeletal muscle. So this is the one that we'll talk most about all the time as well. So for skeletal muscle, it is controlled voluntarily. So you can, for the most part, move your arm when you need to move your arm or move your legs when you want to do that. Sometimes you do have involuntary skeletal muscle movements, like a twitch or something will happen, but for the most part, control is voluntary. Um, skeletal muscle is striated, striped. Um, so that makes it pretty easy to identify. You can see here in the drawing, and you'll see this in the actual slide as well. You can see like these darker bands and then lighter bands. And those have to do with the arrangement of the proteins um, for contraction to occur, which is a system that you will learn all about in, maybe November, December. Skeletal muscles have many nuclei, so lots of nuclei, like hundreds of nuclei. And the structure of skeletal muscles are very different than like the cells you learn about in biology. So anyway, and then they also have lots and lots of mitochondria because muscles need to contract to produce movements, um, skeletal muscles. And in order to do that, they have to power the reactions, the reset of the contraction. So lots of mitochondria to produce ATP for movement to occur. So that is skeletal muscle. Remember this when you're identifying visually. So here is a microscopic image of skeletal muscle. This one isn't zoomed in terribly much, like not magnified a ton, but you can still see the striations, those stripes. You can see them pretty well right there, kind of the darker band and the lighter band. You can also see lots and lots of nuclei. So those are kind of a hallmark of skeletal muscle. The other thing you can see is that the bands are in these nice parallel lines. So that's another skeletal muscle hallmark. Okay, so these next two you don't need to identify visually. Cardiac muscle is the first one, and you can see if you look at the image, it looks pretty similar visually to skeletal muscle because it is striated in that same way. Structurally, it's a little bit different because cardiac muscle, you might have guessed from its name, is found in the heart. So cardio was our medical term for heart. Cardiac muscle is heart muscle. The control, thankfully, of your heart is involuntary. So your heart beats on its own. And it has actually a really cool system that keeps it beating, hopefully, as we want it to. Sometimes there are issues with that conduction system, and so people might need like a pacemaker or something to keep it beating involuntarily, but you're not sitting here listening to this thinking beat, beat, beat to your heart, because that would take over your life. So involuntary. And for nuclei, there's only one nucleus per cell. One per cell. So these cells look a little bit more like the kinds of cells that you're familiar with, just a single nucleus. Again, visually very similar looking to the striated muscle, the skeletal muscle that we just saw, but you don't have to identify it visually. So again, here is an image. So you should notice some similarities between the previous micrograph and this one. You can see again kind of the striations, the dark spots are the nuclei. And in cardiac muscle, you can see these kind of the ends of each cell. Those are called intercalated discs, and they help with the conduction system. So that's what it looks like. But again, you don't need to identify it visually. Okay. Our last muscle type is smooth muscle. Okay. Again, don't need to identify it visually. Smooth muscle is found in like the digestive tract and in blood vessels. So those are places where you want those actions to occur involuntarily, just like cardiac muscle. You want your blood vessels regulating blood pressure independent of your thoughts. You want your digestive tract to digest your food independent of your thoughts. So they work involuntarily. And the cells have kind of an interesting shape. They are spindle shaped. called an L in spindle. Um, so if you've seen like Sleeping Beauty, you might have seen a spindle in that, but they're these kind of like long and pointy at both ends shape. They are not striated, which is why it's called smooth muscle versus striated muscle. So no striations, no stripes, and only one nucleus per cell again. So a little more of your typical cell that you learned about back in biology. So smooth muscle. And here it is under the microscope. Again, you don't need to identify visually, but you can see the difference. There's no striping, none of those striations. And you can kind of see the nuclei spread out, and that the nuclei themselves are kind of in that spindle, that like long and thin shape. Okay, so here's just a comparison of the location as well as the structure. So cardiac muscle striations, one nucleus per cell found in the heart. Skeletal muscles, lots of nuclei, striations found in skeletal muscles. And then smooth muscle, no striations, one nucleus, and found in the digestive tract and blood vessels. So these are the three. This is the one that you should be able to identify visually again. Okay, next we have nervous tissue. Nervous tissue we'll talk about a little bit when we talk about muscles in a while. And then we'll also talk about it again at the end of the semester when we talk about the brain and nervous system. So if your brain is full, pause, walk around. If your brain is not yet full, then learn about nervous tissue. Okay, so there are two major classifications, if you will, two major types of nervous tissue. There are the nerves themselves, which are called neurons, and then there are what are called glial cells. And so neurons are what we think of as like nerve cells. That's what they are. And glial cells are all of the supporting cells that make the nervous system function properly. So glial cells don't transmit the information, but they do sort of keep everything clean and neat and tidy so the information can be transferred effectively. Okay, so neurons' job is to transmit information, to take in a stimulus, bring it to the control center, usually in the brain, and then bring the response information back to whatever part of the body. So in order to do that, neurons are both irritable, so they can be irritated. They can sense like changes, and that sends a signal. And they are also conductive. So once they're irritated, once they detect something, then they can conduct that signal to other neurons or up to the brain, or from the brain out to the body itself. So that's what neurons do. They are the transmitters of information. All of the other kind of processes that we think about for living things in the nervous system are done by glial cells. So glial cells, and again, we'll talk more about them when we talk about the nervous system itself. But glial cells support neurons. So like physically anchoring them in the brain and spinal cord, supporting them with like nutrients, insulation, things like that as well. And they also regulate the interstitial fluid. So the fluid that the nerves are bathed in um, is regulated by these glial cells. So it's monitored and then adjusted by the glial cells. So neurons transmitting, glial cells, kind of all of the other support roles in the brain, spinal cord, and the rest of the nervous system. Sorry, I forgot to say, you do need to be able to identify a neuron visually. They have a pretty distinctive shape, and then usually a long axon. And then, but not glial cells. Okay, so neuron, yes, but nothing else with nervous tissue. Okay. Oh. Okay. So we're almost done. Tissue repair is our final short bit for this section. And this, again, we'll talk about more when we talk about specific body systems. So remember, tissues is kind of the foundation, but then we'll build more specifics on top of it. So if a tissue gets damaged, it needs to be repaired. Likely you've had epithelial tissue damage in your life, on your skin, maybe in your mouth if you drank hot chocolate that was a little too hot. And so your body has a couple of different methods of repairing an injured tissue. Regeneration is the best option. This is sort of the creme de la creme of tissue repair. So with regeneration, you replace the destroyed tissue, you being your body, with the same kind of cells, so you can't tell even that the injury occurred. So that's the best thing that can happen. If an injury is too severe, or if the type of tissue that's damaged isn't really able to regenerate, then repair might instead involve a fibrosis. So a fibrosis is basically a scar is created. So dense, fibrous connective tissue. Think about what that kind of tissue looked like. Fibers really closely packed together. And so that kind of tissue repair will leave a scar. That's what scar tissue is. So if an injury is not too severe, like a paper cut, say, or a burn in your mouth, then there will be likely regeneration that can occur. But if an injury is more severe, like you burn your arm with a cookie sheet, for instance, then you might end up with some scar tissue instead. So either way, whichever option is viable for an injury, uh, the following steps occur. So capillaries become very permeable at the site of the injury, so they get like, kind of leaky almost. So fluids can go out, and stuff can be carried away if needed. So that will allow clotting proteins in the blood, those fibers in the blood that we only see during clotting. Those will go to the area to start to form a clot. And then your body walls off the injured area. So if there were bacteria or something on the paper that cut you, they would be blocked off from entering, hopefully, the rest of your body. Then granulation tissue is formed. That's kind of the precursor to the actual new skin, for instance. And then the surface epithelium will regenerate. That's the last step. Um, so form a scab, and then underneath the scab, generally, that's where the new granulation tissue forms, and ultimately, hopefully, the new surface epithelium. I will post a little tissue repair video to Schoology, so if you want to watch that to kind of get a visual of this, you can do that. Otherwise, this is the end of the tissues lectures. Thank you so much for hanging in there. So if you haven't finished the tissues lab or the study packets, those are the things you should work on next. Bye.